Hello, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and it is indeed a privilege to share this time with you. Thank you for sharing your time with me. Today, we're going to continue on in a unit of lessons that we began last week, where we're going to be focusing on the topic of wisdom and discernment. And we're going to be doing that by looking at some Bible stories that we're very familiar with, but which we want to just take that story and see how within that story, wisdom and discernment are such a vital part of all that takes place there. Last week we looked at, since it was Epiphany Sunday, we looked especially at the Magi and their coming. They were wise men. They had understanding, they had learning, they had insights that maybe the common person didn't have because of their study and because of their background. And they emphasize wisdom in that sense of having the clarity of mind and the information and the insights that comes from that. But they also had discernment, because to me, discernment is the active part of wisdom. To know and not do is not good, but to know, to be wise, and be able to take that and use it in a way as to discern between good and evil, to be able to discern situations and be able to see those underlying things. One of the problems that you and I have as human beings is that we just don't have that depth of insight, certainly not that God has. And so, as Christians and as students of the Bible, when we read there about wisdom and discernment, we often see that there's an element of wisdom and discernment that's based upon God's action and interaction with the person involved. God gives them that extra insight, that extra wisdom. Remember how Solomon, when he became king, he asked God for wisdom. And God gave him that special insight that he needed to be a good ruler, to be able to do the things that a good ruler would do. He had also had, though, discernment. He was able to take that wisdom, that understanding, all that information, and use it to guide his decision making, and use the wisdom that God gave him, that extra insight that he gave him, to make even better, more profound decisions and discern between good and evil in a way that most of us can't do all the time. Once in a while we're able to, and boy does it feel good when that happens. And yet we're limited, aren't we? So wisdom and discernment. Last week we looked at the Magi, wise men coming from the east. They acted upon their information. They took it, and then as they interacted with Herod, they also exemplified this idea of discernment as they listened to what he said and saw that he seemed to be sincere when he said, "Please come back and let me know where the child is so I can go worship him too." And yet God again intervenes and gives them that special extra insight so that they can discern that this is not a situation where they need to do that, where they need to go home by another route. And that's what they did. Today we're going to look at a different story. We're going to go way back in the book of Genesis and to the story of Joseph and his brothers. You remember Joseph. He was Jacob's son, Jacob, who later became known as Israel. He was a younger son, and he was kind of special from the beginning. And you know how some people just have that aura about them. You can just tell this guy's got a little something extra. Well, and not only that, but the father took special interest in him, and the brothers were jealous of that. And one day he really tipped the scale when he shared with them a vision that he had had, in which he would be a ruler, be one that they would bow down to, that they would have to give respect to. And certainly as older brothers, they didn't see that as being a part of their future at all. And in that, they became very jealous. They didn't kill him, but they sold him into slavery into Egypt. And we know the story of Joseph in Egypt, how he was again given wisdom, given insight by God to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and based on that interpretation, to see how to act upon it, to discern that, and to make it something, an action plan. And because of that, they stored up the extra grain for 7 years because of the time of drought that was coming. And without that gift from God, without that insight that Joseph had because of God giving it to him, the whole country would have been in terrible straits during this time. And it turned out that not only did Egypt was able to survive this, but they had more that they could trade with others around them who were being hit even harder by the drought. And that's the situation that we find here. Joseph and his brothers and his father Jacob, they've all come to Egypt, and as they have been there for a while, settled in, that sort of thing, Jacob, being older, dies. And the brothers say, "Oh my, Joseph and our father had such a special relationship. He's told us that he's forgiven us for all those things we did to him. But now that Dad's not here, is he really going to stand by those things?" And a little cold chill went through them, I'm sure, as they thought about, oh no, now that Dad's not here, now that Joseph doesn't have to think about hurting Dad and his feelings, how is he going to respond to us? And that's where we pick up here in Genesis, the 50th chapter. I want to start off by reading verses 15 through verses 17. When Joseph's brothers realized that their father was now dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and wants to pay us back severely for all the terrible things we did to him?" So they approached Joseph and said, "Your father gave orders before he died, telling us, 'This is what you should say to Joseph. Please forgive your brother's sins and misdeeds, for they did terrible things to you. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of your father's God.' Joseph wept when they spoke to him." This is a powerful situation. Joseph had already given his forgiveness to them, and yet there was still that straw that was waiting, the straw that might break the camel's back, and that the straw was that Jacob had been alive, and they saw that maybe Joseph's response was different then than it would be now that he was gone. Instead, Joseph wept. He was filled with all sorts of emotions because his brothers still felt hesitant about accepting his forgiveness. One of the things about forgiveness is to be forgiven, you have to want to be forgiven. You have to acknowledge that you've done something wrong. Otherwise, what forgiveness is doesn't mean anything, does it? If someone just says, "I forgive you," and you don't know what they're talking about, what it is they forgave you for, then it's not the same thing, is it? And so forgiveness here in this situation, Joseph is trying to say to his brothers, "I have forgiven you, and when I did that in sincerity and in fullness of heart." What about you? Have you ever had a time when something happened between you and a friend or someone else, or maybe peers at school, or maybe someone at work? All sorts of countless situations that we can get into where forgiveness becomes an element, a needful element. Do you think if you were in Joseph's shoes that you would have been as able to say, "I forgive you," as he was? It's a powerful question, isn't it? And I'm sure some thoughts came to you of some pretty negative kind of situations, more than just the everyday run-of-the-mill bumping against other people's ideas and hopes and dreams and that kind of thing, but some really significant issues where forgiveness was quite hard because it meant a moving away from that and letting it go, and it was a powerful issue. Well, think on that. Could I forgive as Joseph exemplifies forgiveness here? Let's look on. Verse 18. His brothers wept too. They fell down in front of him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I God? You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it, in order to save the lives of many people, just as he is doing today. Now don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children." So he put them at ease and spoke reassuringly to them. Here again, Joseph reinforces his forgiveness and his love for his brothers and his faithfulness in forgiveness. That's one of the things about forgiveness from God, too, isn't it? God forgives us sometimes and we think, that was almost too easy. And if you think that, probably it was too easy. Because forgiveness comes at a price to those who are forgiven as well as to those who forgive. To the forgiven, it puts the responsibility back on you to learn from that experience, to take that and become wiser because of the insight that you have now about how that road that you were traveling on at that time wasn't the road you need to keep traveling on. The way you were interacting with other people is not a way that you need to change because it causes situations that are very caustic and very negative in families and all sorts of relationships that can happen. And yet, to let it go, to forgive, is something that comes at a great price too. Just think of what it cost God as He sent His Son to die for our sins. He forgave and He acted out His forgiveness in a concrete sort of way that says, you are indeed important to me. Trust me. Love me. All I ask is that as I have loved you, you love me back. What a powerful, powerful thing. Joseph said to them as they wept and knelt down before him, just as he had seen in his dream years before, he said to them, don't be afraid. It sounds a little bit like those angels coming to Elizabeth and to Mary and all the angelic visitations that we have in the Bible where the angels typically say, fear not, don't be afraid. Joseph here is giving to them a sense of comfort and understanding. I know this is something you may have a hard time grasping, but I really have sincerely forgiven you. And I'm not trying to play God. I'm not judging you. Boy, judgment is a powerful thing in our world, isn't it? We judge everything and each other all the time. And that's a shame because I don't have that wisdom to be able to tell you why you did a certain thing. I spent many years working as a counselor. One of the things that I did as a counselor was I would try to help people come to the point where they got in touch with what they were thinking and the choices that they were making at the time the problem was created. And so they can back up a little bit and kind of go at it again in a different way, that insight. But I'm not the source of forgiveness. I'm not the source of judgment. Matter of fact, when people come to counseling, they've already judged themselves. They come in and they say, something's not right. I'm not doing well, and I'm not sure why. And I'm not sure why either as a counselor. I certainly don't have that crystal ball where I can say, oh, well, here's what happened the other day when you fussed with your friend. You were really kind of crude and rude with them, and you need to go back and forgive them for that, or ask them to forgive you for that. No, we don't have that. We're not God. God and God alone can see our heart, can see the intent, can see all the things that led up to that. And sometimes there are years worth of things that add up to a moment where there's a really negative incident of some kind. Certainly as a counselor, I've seen that in relationships where people keep score. That's the way of talking about it. And for years they're keeping score. Well, you didn't this. Well, you didn't that. Well, I did this, but you didn't that. And here we go, back and forth, keeping score. Instead of and using that as a tool to judge one another and not say, when you do this, it hurts me, and if you really love me and care for me, you'll hear that and you'll respond to it in a way that can soften that a little bit. Whether you feel terribly wrong with it or not, you understand and you respond to in that understanding. Wisdom, discernment. Joseph had an insight here that is truly godly. At this point, years have passed, and he has been through a myriad of all kinds of negative, bad situations. And yet, he at this point is able to look back and say, I can tell that even though all this was started by evil thoughts and by greed and by envy and that sort of thing, God has taken this situation and allowed me to continue to walk with him through it, and he has made something good of it. Look at it, brothers. If I hadn't come to Egypt, if I hadn't had the opportunity to prepare a way, if I hadn't had the opportunity and the wisdom of God and the insights that God gave to me to be able to rise in my position, think of all the people, our family and all other people who would be really hurting now. But God in his love saw me as a person at a critical place and that could be used to bring good out of even something bad that seemed to start the ball rolling in that direction. How about you? Have you ever had a time when something bad seemed eventually to be used by God to produce good? Sometimes God teaches us lessons not by inflicting pain and suffering upon us, but by giving us the insights to see where that pain and suffering came from, what to do about it, and how to move past that. So many people get stuck because they don't go to God and they don't say, Father, help me understand what is going on here. Give me a peace about it. Whether I can have the cognitive ability to analyze every little detail of it, and it's not important. I just need peace, Lord. I need that kind of sense of forgiveness that will allow me to let it go and move on. Wisdom that leads to discernment, letting go and moving on. And so Joseph again reaffirms to his brothers, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And we, as Paul Harvey would say, we read the rest of the story, and we see that indeed, in the lifetime of Joseph, the people flourished there, and the Egyptians remembered Joseph. And it was years later that another Pharaoh rose to power, one who had no memory of Joseph and had no memory of all these sort of things that had taken place and how Joseph had saved his people from a famine and that sort of thing. And he responded to the Jewish people as a potential problem and enslaved them. God took something bad, made something good from it. Later, other things developed, but that's progression. That's life. That's the way things go. But Joseph was able to say to them, I have been placed in a position to bless you, and now I do that, and thank you for it. It's hard to be a Joseph, isn't it? It's hard to do for others when they have been kind of rude and crude and not very open and positive with us. I see it so much in families and in close relationships of all kinds. Sometimes that youngest child that was always put down and looked down upon and kind of joked about and treated ugly is the one who ends up being the caregiver to the parents in their old age. And they, like Joseph, are able to say, because of my youth, because I am still here at this stage of my life and able to do this, I can be a blessing to my parents and give them back something special. Maybe you can think about other things in your life too, where God is taking something that seemed like it might be bad and turned it for the good. One quick incident that I can remember in my own life was I was graduating from high school when Vietnam was going on. I'd never thought about being in the military, really. I mean, I'd watched war movies and John Wayne and all that kind of thing, and you get a little rah-rah about that. But I never thought about being a soldier. My father hadn't been a soldier. He was worked at the steel mills during World War II and had a deferment because of that. Uh, no close relatives had been in the military, and so I just really wasn't thinking about it. When the draft came along and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "We need you," uh, I was a little upset. I was kind of like, "How dare you uh, intervene in my life at this such a crucial point of life for me and pull me away to do something other than what I'm really hoping to do?" And yet I look back now and I see how all of that came together to give me relationships and experiences and other things that have been formative in my life and have been a base upon which my life has been built, a base upon which my faith was enriched and my relationship with God was enhanced. I wouldn't have chosen that. God didn't put that upon me so that would happen, but it did put me in a situation that I might not have faced for a long time, if at all, in just the regular situation that I was living in. Being taken out of that and put into something else caused me to reflect, caused me to think about who I was and who I wanted to be. Wisdom and discernment, our own lives, forgiveness, being forgiven. These are important things, and I hope there are things that can be a part of your life in this week ahead. As you think on Joseph and all the things that God did through him and for him, likewise, he's available to you and I, and he asks us to come boldly before his throne of grace and present there each of those concerns. Do that this week. In God's name,